You didn't fire a contract, you destroyed a family. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but they were already hanging in the air as Lily Harper stood barefoot on the cold marble floor of a mansion that never felt like home, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the thin envelope that had once promised her survival and now felt like a quiet sentence she had been waiting for since the day she signed it. And across the vast living room, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked miles of perfectly trimmed lawns and a skyline glowing in soft gold, Daniel Carter didn't look at her the way he had 3 months ago. No hesitation, no curiosity, just distance, the kind that freezes everything in place. His voice calm, controlled, almost too controlled. "It's over, Lily," he said, and somehow that hurt more than if he had raised his voice, because it meant he had already decided, already erased her, already rewritten the story in his mind where she was never real to begin with. And Lily swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure even the walls could hear it. 3 months ago she had walked into this same house with a suitcase that barely zipped and a contract she didn't fully understand but desperately needed. Her mother's hospital bills stacked like a countdown clock she couldn't stop. Eviction notices tucked under her door like reminders that the world didn't wait for anyone to catch up. And Daniel Carter had stood in front of her then, sharp suit, unreadable eyes, offering her something that sounded impossible and yet terrifyingly simple. "Marry me. It's just a contract." And she had laughed, not because it was funny but because it didn't make sense, because people like him didn't marry people like her, because life didn't just hand you a solution wrapped in fine print. But he had slid the papers across the table anyway, outlining rules like boundaries carved in stone. No love, no expectations, no interference, just appearances, just a role, just a temporary fix for problems too big to explain in a single sentence. And she had signed it. Not because she believed in it, but because she had run out of choices, and somehow, somewhere between awkward dinners and quiet mornings, and 2 little girls who watched her like she might disappear if they blinked too long, the contract had started to feel less like paper and more like something fragile and real, something she wasn't supposed to care about, but did anyway. And now, standing here again, she realized maybe she had always known how this would end. Maybe people like Daniel Carter didn't break their own rules. Maybe contracts were meant to end cleanly, without emotion, without regret. And yet her chest tightened as if something inside her refused to accept that, because this didn't feel clean. It felt like something had cracked open, something that couldn't be fixed with signatures or silence. And still, she forced herself to stand straight, to hold on to whatever dignity she had left, because if this was the moment everything ended, she wouldn't let him see how much it mattered that it did. Daniel did not move after saying it, as if stillness could make the moment less real, his hands resting on the edge of the glass table behind him, fingers slightly curled, the faint reflection of Lily's silhouette staring back at him from the polished surface. And for a second, just a second, something flickered in his eyes before it disappeared behind the same controlled expression he had perfected over years of boardrooms and negotiations, because to him, this was just another decision, another necessary cut, another line drawn to maintain order. But to Lily, it felt like the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she could not recover from. And yet she did not cry, not here, not in front of him, not in the place where she had tried so hard to belong without ever being asked to. Instead, she nodded once, slowly, almost as if she had been expecting this exact outcome from the beginning. And that small motion seemed to surprise him more than any argument would have, because he had prepared himself for resistance, for emotion, for something messy, but not for quiet acceptance. And that silence pressed between them heavier than any words could have, until Lily finally spoke, her voice steady but soft. "I understand." And she did not add anything else, did not ask why, did not defend herself, even though she could feel the accusation hanging unspoken in the room. The whispers that had started days ago, the way the staff had looked at her differently, the sudden cold distance in Daniel's tone, all pointing to something she had not done but was now paying for anyway. And Daniel exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if her calm response unsettled him more than anger would have, because it made him question something he was not ready to face. But he pushed that thought aside just as quickly, reminding himself of the report on his desk, the numbers that did not add up, the email that suggested a leak. The timing that was too precise to ignore, and the fact that Lily had been the only new variable in his life when everything started to shift, logic over emotion. Always. That was how he had built everything he owned, and he was not about to abandon that now. Even if something in his chest felt unexpectedly tight. You can keep the compensation outlined in the contract, he added, his tone returning to that distant professionalism, as if they were back in that first meeting again, as if nothing had changed between then and now. And Lily let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor, because of course it would end like this, reduced back to numbers and clauses and signatures, as if the past 3 months could be measured and settled with a check. And she reached into the envelope, pulling out the ring he had given her, the one that had felt too heavy the first time she wore it, too perfect, too unreal, and now it felt exactly what it was meant to be, a symbol of something that was never supposed to last. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and gently placed it on the table beside his hand, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room. "I will not need it," she said, and for the first time, Daniel looked directly at her, really looked, as if seeing her not as a problem to solve, but as something else entirely, something he could not define in that moment. But before he could say anything, before he could even process that hesitation, the sound of small footsteps broke through the silence from the hallway. Quick, uneven, unmistakably urgent, and Lily's heart clenched because she knew exactly who it was. And this was the part she had not prepared for, not the contract, not the ending, but them. The sound came again, faster this time, small feet against hardwood, uneven breaths that did not belong in a house that was always so controlled. And before either of them could react, Sophie appeared in the doorway, her hair slightly messy, her eyes wide and searching, and right behind her, Emma, clutching something tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing holding her together. And the moment they saw Lily standing there with the empty look she was trying so hard to hide, everything shifted, because children did not need explanations. They felt the truth before anyone spoke it. "What is happening?" Sophie asked, her voice sharper than usual, too mature for her age, as her gaze moved from Lily to Daniel and back again, trying to piece together something that did not make sense. And Lily forced a small smile, the kind that almost worked if you did not look too closely. "It is nothing, sweetheart," she said gently, though her voice carried a softness that made Emma's grip tighten around what she was holding, and Daniel stepped forward, already preparing the answer he thought would keep things simple, keep things contained. "Lily is leaving," he said, direct, efficient, the same way he would announce a change in schedule or a canceled meeting. And for a second, the room went completely still, as if even the air itself paused to see how those words would land, and they landed harder than he expected, because Sophie's expression changed instantly, confusion turning into something sharper, something closer to disbelief. "Leaving," she repeated, her brows pulling together. Why would she leave? And Daniel did not hesitate, because hesitation was weakness, because clarity was control, because her role here is finished, he replied. And that was the moment everything broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, irreversible way, because Emma stepped forward slowly, her small hands trembling as she held up what she had been carrying, a slightly wrinkled drawing on thick paper, colors uneven but bright, and Lily felt her breath catch the second she saw it. Because she knew that drawing. She had been there when Emma made it, sitting at the kitchen table with crayons spread everywhere, laughing when Emma insisted the sky had to be purple because blue was too boring, and now that drawing was being held between them like proof of something none of them could deny. Then, "What is this?" Emma asked, her voice small but steady in a way that did not belong to a 7-year-old, and she turned the paper so Daniel could see it clearly, for figures drawn side by side, uneven but unmistakable, one tall, one slightly shorter, and 2 smaller ones in between, all holding hands under a purple sky, and above them, in careful, slightly crooked letters, the word family. And Daniel looked at it, really looked at it, and for the first time since this began, his expression faltered, because this was not a contract, this was not a transaction, this was something that did not fit into any logic he could rely on. And Emma's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Families do not have roles," she said softly, each word landing heavier than anything Lily or Daniel had said. They do not just finish. And Lily turned away slightly, because that was the part she could not bear, not the leaving, not the contract, but this, the way something real had grown where it was never supposed to. And Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something uncomfortable, something that did not follow rules or reason. And for the first time, he was not entirely sure he had made the right decision. But the silence stretched again, and no one moved. Because once something like this is spoken, nothing can go back to the way it was before. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence, the kind that stretched just a little too long, told Sophie everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Because for the first time in her life, her father looked unsure, not in the way of a missed detail or a delayed meeting, but in a deeper way, like something inside him had shifted and he did not know how to fix it. And Sophie took a step forward, placing herself slightly in front of Emma without even thinking, protective. In a way that came naturally. You said she had a role, she repeated, slower now, as if giving him a chance to correct himself, to take it back, to say something that would make sense again. But Daniel straightened slightly, that familiar wall returning as he reached for the only thing he trusted, logic. This was an agreement, he said, his tone firm again, controlled. It had terms, and those terms have ended. And Lily closed her eyes for a brief second, because hearing it reduced like that, stripped of everything it had become, hurt more than she expected, and Emma shook her head immediately, small but certain, clutching the drawing tighter against her chest. No, she said, her voice trembling now, but refusing to break. That is not true. And she looked directly at Daniel, not as a child looking at her father, but as someone asking to be understood. You said she would help us, Emma continued. You said she would stay. And Daniel hesitated, just enough for it to show, because he had said that, not in those exact words, but in the way he had allowed things to unfold, in the way he had not corrected the girls when they began to trust Lily, when they began to depend on her. And Sophie stepped closer now, her voice lower but sharper. You always say promises matter, she added. You told me that when I broke mine. Last year, remember? And that memory hit him harder than expected. A simple moment he had barely thought about again, now turned against him in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and Lily felt her chest tighten, because this was exactly what she had feared, not the contract ending, but the girls being caught in something they did not deserve, and she took a step forward quickly, forcing a gentle tone into her voice. Hey, she said softly, kneeling slightly to meet their eyes. It is. Okay. Really, this was always temporary. And even as she said it, the words felt wrong, like they did not belong to the reality they had lived in for the past 3 months. And Emma looked at her immediately, shaking her head again, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. Then why does it feel like it is not? She whispered. And that question, simple and honest, landed in the center of the room like something none of them could answer. Because feelings did not follow contracts. They did not end on schedule. They did not care about terms or logic. And Daniel felt that truth pressing in on him from all sides, from the drawing still held between them, from the way Lily avoided looking directly at him now, from the way his daughters stood there not as children asking questions, but as something else entirely, something that saw through everything he was trying to hold on to. And for the first time, he realized this was not just about ending an agreement. This was about undoing something real, something he had not planned, something he had not controlled. And that was the part that unsettled him the most, because control had always been the one thing he never lost. And now, standing in his own home, surrounded by the consequences of a decision that suddenly did not feel as clear as it had moments ago, he found himself facing something he could not calculate, and that was far more dangerous than any business risk he had ever taken. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, like every word left unsaid was pressing down on all of them at once. And Daniel slowly reached for the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the ring Lily had placed there moments ago, the small piece of metal suddenly carrying more weight than any contract he had ever signed. And for the first time, he did not immediately push the feeling away, because something about the way Emma's drawing still hovered between them refused to be ignored. And he looked at it again, really looked this time, at the uneven lines, the mismatched colors, the way the 4 figures were drawn holding hands without any space between them, as if whoever had drawn it believed completely that they belonged together, no conditions, no expiration date, just together, and that simplicity unsettled him more than any complicated problem ever had, because it made everything he had just said feel smaller, colder, incomplete, and Sophie noticed the shift before anyone else, because she had spent years learning how to read her father's silence, learning the difference between when he was thinking and when he was avoiding something. And this was different. This was hesitation, real hesitation, and she stepped closer, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "If this was just business," she said, "then why did you let it become more?" And Daniel opened his mouth slightly, ready to respond, ready to explain, to justify, but no words came, because the answer was not something he had ever allowed himself to consider, and Lily saw that moment, saw the crack in his certainty, and for a second, something inside her wanted to hold on to it, to believe that maybe this was not as final as it seemed, but she forced herself to let that thought go, because hope, in a situation like this, could be more painful than the truth, and she stood up straight again, pulling her shoulders back slightly as if preparing herself to walk away for real this time. "It is not their responsibility to understand this," she said quietly, her voice gentle but clear. "They should not have to fix what we agreed from the beginning." And Emma shook her head immediately, stepping closer to Lily and wrapping one arm around her waist as if trying to hold her in place. "We are not fixing anything," she said, her voice small but determined. "We are telling the truth." And that word, truth, seemed to echo in Daniel's mind longer than it should have, because for years, he had believed truth was something you defined through facts, through evidence, through logic. But standing here now, it felt different. It felt like something simpler and harder at the same time, something you could not calculate or control. And he looked at Lily again, noticing details he had ignored before, the way her hands were slightly trembling even though her voice remained steady, the way she avoided stepping too close to the girls as if she was already trying to create distance, preparing herself for a separation she never wanted but had accepted anyway. And that realization hit him harder than he expected, because it meant she was not fighting him, not arguing, not trying to stay. She was letting go, and for some reason, that felt wrong, more wrong than anything else in this moment. And Sophie took another step forward, her voice quieter now, but filled with something deeper, something that sounded almost like disappointment. "You always say strong people take responsibility," she said, looking directly at him. "So are you going to pretend this was just a contract, or are you going to admit that you are the one who changed it?" And Daniel felt that question settle heavily in his chest, because it was no longer about what the contract said or what the evidence suggested. It was about something else entirely, something he had not planned for and could no longer ignore. And for the first time since this began, he did not have an immediate answer, and that absence of certainty, that unfamiliar pause, marked the beginning of something he could not yet define, but knew he could not walk away from as easily as he had thought just moments ago. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than frustration or control, and for the first time in a long time, he did not try to immediately fill the silence with a decision, because something about this moment refused to be rushed, and he looked at his daughters again, really looked at them, not as children who needed guidance, but as two people standing in front of him with a clarity he had somehow missed. And then his gaze shifted to Lily, still standing there, with that quiet strength that had unsettled him from the very beginning, the kind that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And suddenly the pieces that had seemed so certain just hours ago no longer fit together as cleanly as he had believed, because if she had truly been what he suspected, if she had been careless or opportunistic, she would have argued, defended herself, stayed, but she had done none of that. She had simply accepted his decision and prepared to walk away, and that did not align with the version of events he had convinced himself was true, and that realization sat heavily in his chest, forcing him to confront something he had been avoiding, not just about her, but about himself. And Sophie watched him carefully, her expression softening just slightly as she sensed the shift. "You always tell us to think before we decide something important," she said quietly, not accusing this time, but reminding him of his own rules. "So why are you not doing that now?" And Daniel's jaw tightened for a brief second, not out of anger, but because the question landed exactly where it needed to, and he glanced toward the hallway instinctively, as if expecting the answer to be waiting somewhere outside this room. But there was nothing there, just the stillness of a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar, and Lily felt that change too. The way the tension in the room had shifted from finality to something else, something uncertain, something unfinished, and that was more dangerous than anything, because uncertainty left space for hope, and hope was something she could not afford to hold on to, not again, not after everything she had already risked, and she gently placed her hand over Emma's, giving it a soft squeeze. "Hey," she whispered, her voice warm but steady. "You have school tomorrow, remember?" Trying to bring the moment back to something simple, something normal, but Emma did not move, did not let go, her small fingers tightening slightly as she looked up at Lily, then back at Daniel. And there was something different in her expression now, not just sadness, but determination, the kind that mirrored Sophie's in a quieter way. "If she leaves," Emma said slowly, each word careful, "then we leave too." And the room went still again. But this time it was not confusion or hesitation, it was impact, because those words did not sound like a threat, they sounded like a decision, and Daniel felt it immediately. The weight of it, the reality behind it, because his daughters were not being dramatic, they were being honest, and honesty, he was starting to realize, was far more difficult to ignore than anything else. And Sophie nodded once beside her sister, reinforcing the statement without needing to repeat it, her eyes never leaving his. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter found himself standing in a situation where the usual solutions did not apply, where authority did not resolve the problem, where logic alone could not carry him through. And as he looked at the three of them, the woman he had reduced to a contract and the two girls who refused to accept that version of reality, he understood something he had not allowed himself to see before, that this was no longer about whether Lily should stay or go. It was about whether he was willing to admit that what had been built in this house was never just an agreement. And that realization, quiet but undeniable, marked the point where everything began to change. Daniel did not react immediately, and that was what made it different this time, because in every other moment of his life, decisions came quickly, cleanly, without hesitation. But now, standing in his own living room, with his daughters looking at him not with fear or obedience, but with quiet certainty, he felt something shift in a way he could not ignore, and his eyes moved slowly from Sophie to Emma, then to Lily, and for a brief moment, he saw everything not as separate pieces, not as problems to solve, but as something connected, something he had unknowingly allowed to grow beyond the limits he had set. And that realization brought with it an uncomfortable truth, one that had been there all along but had gone unnoticed because he had never stopped long enough to look for it. And he reached for the edge of the table again, his fingers brushing against the contract that still lay there, the document that had once defined everything so clearly, so precisely, and now felt incomplete, almost meaningless in the face of what stood in front of him. And he picked it up slowly, unfolding it with a deliberate motion, as if reminding himself of the terms he had written, the boundaries he had established, the control he had insisted on maintaining, and for a second, it worked. For a second, the familiar structure grounded him, gave him something solid to hold on to, until his eyes drifted again to the drawing still clutched in Emma's hands. And the contrast between the two could not have been clearer. One was exact, controlled, defined by conditions, and the other was imperfect, emotional, undefined, and yet somehow, the second one felt more real, more true, and he let out a quiet breath, his voice lower now, less certain than before. "You do not understand how complicated this is," he said, not as a dismissal, but as an attempt to explain something he himself was still trying to grasp, and Sophie shook her head slightly, her expression calm but unwavering. "No," she replied. "You are the one making it complicated." And that simple response cut through everything else, because it stripped away the layers he had built, the justifications, the reasoning, the need to control every outcome, and left only the core of the situation, something far simpler and far more difficult to face. And Lily watched the exchange quietly, her heart pulling in two directions at once, because part of her wanted to believe that this moment meant something, that it could change something, but another part of her knew better, knew that reality did not always follow emotion, and she stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to remind herself of where she stood. This is not their responsibility, she said again, more firmly this time, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. They should not have to choose between us. And Emma turned to her immediately, her eyes wide, shaking her head again. We are not choosing, she said softly. We already did. And she looked back at Daniel, holding his gaze with a quiet strength that did not belong to a child. We chose you, she continued, and we chose her too. And that was the moment everything settled into place in a way Daniel could no longer ignore, because this was not about losing control. This was about what he was willing to lose if he held on to it. And for the first time, the question shifted, not whether Lily belonged here, but whether he was ready to admit that he had already made room for her in a way no contract could define. And as he stood there, holding a document that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different version of himself, he realized that the next decision he made would not just end an agreement, it would define what kind of man he truly was. And that was something no contract could protect him from. Daniel looked down at the contract in his hands, the crisp paper that had once represented certainty, now feeling strangely fragile, as if the meaning behind it had already begun to dissolve. And for a long moment, he said nothing, because for the first time, he was not searching for the right answer. He was searching for the right truth, and those were not always the same thing. And slowly, almost unconsciously, his grip on the document loosened, his fingers tracing the edge as if trying to hold on to the version of himself that had believed everything could be controlled if it was written clearly enough, defined strictly enough, protected carefully enough. But as he lifted his gaze again, meeting Lily's eyes fully this time, something shifted in a way that made that belief feel incomplete, because she was not looking at him with anger or expectation. She was looking at him with acceptance, the kind that comes from someone who has already prepared themselves to walk away. And that realization hit harder than any accusation ever could, because it meant she had already let go of him, even if he had not realized what he was losing yet. And Sophie noticed it too. The way his posture changed, the way his voice had not returned to that cold certainty. And she stepped closer, her tone softer now, but filled with something deeper, something hopeful. You always say actions matter more than words, she reminded him quietly. And for a moment, Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if allowing that statement to settle fully, because it was true. It had always been true. And yet he had been standing here, relying on words written months ago instead of what had been built in front of him every day since. And when he opened his eyes again, there was something different there, not hesitation this time, but clarity, not the kind that comes from logic, but the kind that comes from finally seeing something for what it is. And without another word, he lowered the contract slightly, his gaze never leaving Lily's. And then, in one simple, deliberate motion, he tore it in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room, cutting through everything that had been holding them there. And for a second, no one moved, not because they were shocked, but because they understood exactly what that meant. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling in as he dropped the torn pieces onto the table beside the ring, symbols of something that no longer defined what stood between them. And his voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer distant or controlled. It was steady, grounded, real. This was a mistake, he said quietly, not referring to her, but to the way he had tried to define something that was never meant to be limited. And Lily felt her breath catch, not because she expected this, but because she had stopped expecting anything at all. And he took a step forward, closing the distance she had created earlier, not forcing it, just enough to stand in front of her as an equal, not as someone with authority, but as someone choosing to be present. Not you, he added softly, his voice carrying a sincerity that had been absent before. The contract. And Emma let out a small breath she had been holding, her grip on Lily loosening just slightly, while Sophie's expression softened in a way that showed she had been waiting for this moment, not as a victory, but as something right finally being acknowledged. And Daniel glanced briefly at his daughters before returning his attention to Lily, because this was no longer about anyone else. It was about what he was willing to say and do without conditions, without protection, without distance. And for the first time, he allowed himself to stand there without any of those things, knowing that whatever came next would not be guaranteed, would not be controlled, but would be real. And that was something he had never chosen before. until now. For a moment, no one spoke, because some moments are too full to interrupt, and this was one of them. The kind where everything that mattered had already been said without needing to be repeated, and Lily stood there, her eyes fixed on the torn pieces of paper on the table as if trying to understand what they truly meant, because for so long, that contract had defined her place in this house, her limits, her boundaries, her safety. And now it was gone, and what remained was something far more uncertain, far more real. And that was what made her hesitate, not fear, but the weight of stepping into something that could no longer be controlled or predicted. And Daniel saw that hesitation immediately, not as rejection, but as something he had caused, something he now had to face honestly. And he did not move closer this time, did not try to close the distance on his own terms. Instead, he stayed where he was, giving her the space to decide, his voice quieter now, but steady in a way that carried more meaning than anything he had said before. "You do not have to stay," he said, and that single sentence shifted everything again, because for the first time, there was no pressure, no condition, no expectation, just a choice. And Lily looked up at him slowly, searching his face for the version of him she had come to know, the one who had quietly stood beside her in small moments, who had watched her with something unspoken in his eyes, and the one who had just moments ago been ready to let her walk away without question. And somehow, both of those versions existed at once, and the difference now was that he was no longer hiding behind the easier one. And Sophie let out a soft breath, stepping back slightly as if giving the moment back to them, while Emma's small hand remained wrapped around Lily's, not pulling, not forcing, just there, steady and warm, a quiet reminder of everything that had grown between them without permission. And Lily's gaze softened as she looked down at Emma, then back at Sophie, and finally at Daniel again. And in that sequence, something settled inside her, not certainty, not a guarantee, but a decision, and she let out a slow breath she had been holding since the moment this all began. "I know," she said softly, her voice carrying both the weight of everything that had happened and the possibility of what could come next. And she took a small step forward, not closing the distance completely, but enough to show she was no longer standing at the edge of leaving. And Daniel felt that shift immediately, the way something in the room eased just slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because something real had been chosen, instead of something easy. And Emma smiled faintly through her tears, her grip relaxing as if she had been holding onto something fragile that was finally safe, while Sophie's expression softened into something quieter, something that looked a lot like relief. And Daniel glanced at the drawing still in Emma's hand, the uneven figures under a purple sky, and for the first time, he did not see it as something simple or childish. He saw it as something true, something he had nearly lost because he had tried to define it instead of understand it. And he reached out slowly, not for Lily, not yet, but for the space between them, leaving the next step open, unforced. And in that moment, the house no longer felt like a place of conditions and roles. It felt like something else entirely, something that could not be written into a contract or measured in terms, something that existed only because they chose it, again and again. And as the silence settled around them, softer now, lighter, it carried with it a quiet understanding that what had begun as an agreement had become something far more meaningful, not because it was planned, but because it was real. And for the first time, that was enough.